Hi, everybody. Welcome to this next week. I'm so excited to talk about sensory processing disorder. It really is one of my favorite topics to discuss. There's new research coming out all the time, and so I am just so excited to jump in and talk about this. I think the only reason I'm disappointed is because this is really the week that we do so many hands-on activities when we used to be face-to-face. So I'm a little bummed that we're not doing those same hands-on activities, but I am excited to still have this conversation with you. So let's go ahead and get started. So when we talk about sensory processing, it's important to understand what sensations we're talking about. And if you remember growing up in school or even at home before you went to school, you learned about the five senses, right? Taste, touch, smell, hearing, and sight. And so it really is so common for people to only think about those five senses when you hear sensory processing. But actually in the 70s, Dr. Jean Ayers said, there's actually more to this whole sensation processing than we're really recognizing. And so she actually started talking about two different internal sensations, making the total seven senses altogether. And so we're going to talk in detail specifically about proprioception and the vestibular input. So, and then later on, after Jean Ayers talked about these two different sensations, there's an eighth sense that we're also going to talk about called interoception. So in addition to those five original senses that you might have already been familiar with, we're going to discuss how proprioception, which is body awareness, is perceived by children and how children are either hypo or hyper in their intake of that information. And then we're also going to talk about the vestibular system, and we're going to talk about interoception as well. So let's get started. So the internal senses, proprioception is fascinating to me because so many of us who don't have any kind of difficulty taking in proprioceptive information take this sense for granted. And so we have receptors in our joints and ligaments that tell us how much pressure we're putting on, let's say, our feet to take a step, or how much pressure we are exerting when we're giving somebody a hug, what feels like too much, what feels too tight, what feels like just enough, or if you're being tickled. Those are all proprioceptive input examples. And so for children, this is what we see when children are either hyposensitive or hypersensitive to proprioceptive impact. And what it does is it tells the brain where we are in relation to other objects and how we move. So like I said about the stepping, so how much pressure we use to take a step, how much pressure we use to, let's say, maneuver around our classroom, how much pressure we're using in touch, in any kind of contact with other people or other things in our environment. So I see a lot of hyposensitivity when I'm working with children. And what this is an under responsiveness. This means that children are not getting a lot of input in their proprioceptive receptors, which means they're seeking that input out. When a child isn't getting the appropriate feedback, they're going to look for other ways to get that need met. So an example that I love to give for this, for hyposensitivity is my niece. And you're going to hear a lot about children with autism that I worked with who also have sensory processing disorder. What I want you to know is that if a child has sensory processing disorder, it does not mean that they also have autism. But in the same breath, I'm also going to say it is very common for children who have autism to also have sensory processing disorder. But it's not like every child with sensory processing disorder is going to get a diagnosis of autism. So they're related, but they're not they're not so connected that each one exists always with the other one. So my niece that I'm talking about does have a diagnosis of autism, and she is just 7 months younger than my daughter. So she's about to turn 14. But when they were little, she's also very tall. So she's always been 7 months younger, but 4 to 5 inches taller than my daughter. And I'll never forget, there was a time when we were watching a youth baseball game, and there was like a little step off of the dirt, and my daughter and my niece said, we're going to play a pushing game. And immediately I thought, this is not a good idea. But I believe in natural consequences and children learning what those consequences are. So of course my daughter goes first in this pushing game, and she gives my niece a little push off of the little step, and my niece runs and laughs, and oh, that's so fun, that's so funny. And here comes my niece's turn, and she just shoves my daughter. My daughter goes flying off the step and falls in the dirt. And so I knew that wasn't going to be a good idea, but immediately my daughter comes running, Maddie pushed me. And I said, oh, I saw you two playing the pushing game. And so it was a great opportunity for me to explain to my daughter that for her cousin who is hyposensitive and her proprioceptive input, that big push that she gave to my daughter felt like a little tiny push, felt like the exact same little push that my daughter gave to my niece. And so it was to help her understand that Maddie craves this big input. She is the best hugger. She wants to give these big giant hugs and squeezes all the time. And she really, you can see her whole body just calm and regulate when she gets that pressure and that input that she's craving. So that's just one example of a child who's craving that input. Children who are hyposensitive also love to jump, love to bump into other things, love to crash. I had another child that I work with, and I went and saw him at his preschool, and his preschool teachers we're having a really hard time with him just running all the time inside the classroom and bumping into tables and chairs and the little sink area. And so we were working together on how to make sure that environment was both safe for him and for the other children in the environment. And so what we noticed is that he was craving input. That's why he was running. He needed to get some kind of feedback from the ground below him and from the environment. And so the only way he knew how to do that is by running and crashing. So what we did is figure out a way for him to get that input while still being safe. And what we decided on is that he was going to hop to each station. So it slowed him down a little bit so it wasn't as dangerous, but still gave him that deep pressure and that deep impact every time he stomped on the ground. So he would hop, hop, hop to the sink, wash his hands, and then it was time for snack, and he would hop, 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 all the way to the table. And so he was getting that input, regulating himself. So by the time he transitioned to where he needed to go, he was ready to sit there at the table. So those are a couple different examples of children who were hyposensitive in their proprioceptive input, so under-responsive. Children who are hyposensitive also enjoy deep, deep pressure. This could be massage, this could be wrapped up really tight in a blanket. I put this picture because it always reminds me of a game I played with one of the children I worked with. And he did not have autism, but he did have some hyposensitivity in his proprioceptive input. And it was to the point where he couldn't sit for a task for very long because he needed to run, he needed to get that need met, and sitting there wasn't getting that need met. So we started every session with some input, with some deep, deep pressure. And we called it a JJ burrito. So I would put him in this blanket and I'd say, okay, what are we going to put in our burrito this week? And he would say, cheese. And so then with every ingredient, he would say, I do deep massages, deep pressure on his stomach, or if he was on his stomach, I would do it on his back and go, cheese, 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 cheese. And then I'd say, what else should we put in our burrito? and he would say silly things like candy, and okay, candy. And then I'd use a different part of my hand and do some deep pressure on his body. And then as soon as he was done naming the ingredients, I'd say, okay, I gotta wrap up the burrito. And I'd wrap him really tight in this blanket. And you could just see his body just calm. And he was regulating. And so then I'd eat up the burrito, and it was a silly way to get him to get that need met, that input that he was craving. And then I'd unwrap him, and he would be able to sit there for an activity, a full activity. And we did that every week until he was able to sit and attend for the entire 45 minutes. So it's really interesting to see how when children get those needs met, they're better able to attend because they're regulating all of those feelings that they're having. So for children who are hypersensitive, that means that they're over responsive. They are getting way too much input. And so you might see children tiptoe, and sometimes that is a result of hypersensitivity in their proprioceptive input. Putting their whole foot down just feels like too much input. They're getting too much information from the ground. Children who are hypersensitive actually tend to appear clumsy, so they trip and fall a lot. They'll bump into things because they're just underestimating or overestimating how much effort they need in order to complete everyday tasks. These are children who, when they're overestimating, they're going to rip the paper when they're coloring because they're just not sure how much effort, how much pressure they're going to need to color on a paper. These are children who have a really difficult time just walking around the classroom. They appear a little anxious because they'll startle at things that are in their space because they can't judge that input. They can't judge where their body is according to the other things in their environment. Okay, so that's too much information. Hypersensitivity is over responsiveness. They're getting too much input in their receptors. Okay, all right. Now let's go to our vestibular system. The vestibular system is interesting because it involves multiple parts of the body. So these are the inner ear, which we had talked about a couple weeks ago, and also the eyes. So it really has to do with balance and with coordination and with, is our body upright? Is our body laying down? So it really has more to do with telling our body how it's oriented. So it especially when it comes to head position. If you think about it, if you've ever laid down or been laying down and then wake up too quickly and felt that dizzy feeling, that's your vestibular system saying, oh, wait a second, I don't know whether I'm laying down, if I'm upright. I'm trying to stabilize that message of where my head is in space. It also has to do with our balance and our coordination. So I've noticed a lot of children who have ear infections, frequent ear infections, they often show a difficulty in their balance and coordination. So they're not able to walk in a straight line. They often walk a little bit more crooked, run into different things. They have a difficult time planning out how to do things. So figuring out, okay, how do I get my body to fit into that space? And so just like the proprioceptive system, there's both hyposensitivity and hypersensitivity. For hyposensitivity, these are children, again, who are not getting enough input in their vestibular system, so they are craving that input. These are children who love to go really, 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 really fast, who love to spin. These are our children who will spin and spin and spin and spin and spin and not get dizzy at all. They could spin all day long if we let them. And they want really intense movement. For example, I had a child at a preschool, and he would just love to ride the bike over and over, round and round and round and round and round and round and round, and just ride his little bike and pedal and pedal and pedal, pedal, and just keep moving in this circle. That was the only thing he did every single day he went to school. And it was because he needed that input. He was craving that vestibular input. These are also children who love being tossed in the air, who love swinging on the swing, who can just swing all day, and the higher the better, who enjoy jumping on furniture, who can crawl through a tunnel with confidence. So these are children who are really, really craving input. Children who are hypersensitive, again, they are over responsive. So they're getting too much information from any vestibular activity. So these are children who are very fearful of things that require any sort of balance, things that challenge their orientation. So I had one little boy that I work with, and when he was a baby, his dad really wanted to do the whole throwing him up in the air and putting him down and throwing him up, because most children will respond positively, like, oh, this is so much fun. But this child looked terrified. Every time the father did that, the child looked like he was in a panic. And so the dad said, oh, I don't know how to get him to not be scared anymore. And he wanted to just stop altogether. He's like, I'm just not going to do it anymore. I don't want to make him upset. And so instead of eliminating input altogether, what we want to do is gradually increase the input so that the child has an opportunity to get used to it, to allow their body to process that movement and that input. And so every visit that we go to the home, and we ask the family to do this input as well, we just do a little back and forth and back and forth. And then we'd also roll him in a little tunnel, just giving him a little bit of input at a time, until one day, about 7 months, the dad said, look at this, when we walked into the house, and he threw the baby up, and the baby smiled, and then went back down and smiled. He still tensed up a little bit, but that was the first time he had ever had a positive reaction to being thrown in the air. And his dad was so excited because he could see progress. But he has to be supported in any of those vestibular activities, and he's going to be 5 years old already. So looking at how long some of this hypersensitivity lasts, he's able to tolerate it a lot more, but still needs some support and some transition time. Okay. Let's go now to interoception. Interoception is really interesting because these are things that come so automatic to so many of us that it's difficult to understand how some children and some individuals have a very difficult time processing this information. So interoception is how we understand and process things like hunger, fullness, thirst, bathroom urges, if we're itchy, when things hurt, and any kind of emotional urges. And so I want to break this down for you. Let's say that you are hungry. How do you feel? What does your body internally tell you when you are hungry? Some of us might get stomach rumbles, you might start feeling a little bit nauseous, you might start getting hunger pains. For children who are hypersensitive to this input, which means they're getting too much information, they might constantly feel hungry, so they're constantly going and asking for a snack or asking for something to drink if they're feeling thirsty, so they're getting too much of that interoceptive input. For children who are hyposensitive, meaning that they are not getting enough information, they might go all day long without telling you that they're hungry because they're not feeling hunger the same way you and I are. The same with going to the bathroom. You might have children who constantly feel like they need to go to the bathroom, and I need to go potty, and they're constantly wanting to go. It's because that feeling when you have to use the restroom is always there, and they're not able to quite process that and regulate that in an appropriate way. Children who are hyposensitive, on the other hand, again, they might be the ones who have an accident while they're playing because they just didn't get that same urgency that other children will get. And now let's talk a little bit about the emotional urges. So even though emotion might seem like it's a cognitive behavior, it gives us physical responses to emotion. So let's say, I want you to think about, how do you feel when you're happy? What are some of the things that happen to your body? Some of us, our heart rate might go up a little bit, but in a good way. Maybe you feel a fluttery sensation in your body. You have physical responses to emotions. Children sometimes aren't able, and individuals who have difficulty with interoception, they might not be able to fully process emotion in the same way or make sense of those feelings and tie them and connect them to emotion. And so when it comes to regulation, or when it comes to really externally showing that that's what they're feeling, it could be very difficult to interpret, especially for us on the outside. So let's say we have a child who isn't yet verbal, is getting this feeling of happiness, but to them, they're not able to quite understand, well, what is this internal sensation I'm feeling? And we might see a child go from a smile to some of the stemming activities, or spinning, or something to try and get regulated, because they're not quite able to process what's happening internally in response to that emotion. And so there are ways to support children in their interoceptive input, and things like meditation. And OT can work with an individual about giving meaning to sensations. So if it's been a couple of hours and we know that it's probably time for that child to be ready to eat, we can say, oh, do you have that feeling in your stomach? You're hungry. And so starting to name that, starting to really support children in understanding what those feelings mean. Okay. All right. Now let's talk a little bit about sensory processing and eating. So when I worked with children, a lot of times what's interesting about eating and sensory processing is children can have aversions and have some and seek out some different textures, some colors. So it could be a preference, either visual, tactile, auditory. So eating really incorporates all of the different sensations. And so you're really, as a professional, like a detective, like, all right, this child doesn't like this food. Let's figure out why. Is it the taste? Is it the smell? Is it the sight? Is it the way that it crunches? Is it the way that it doesn't crunch? What is it that this child is not responding well to? And then same, if a child is seeking a food out and only preferring one food, you can say, well, what is it about this food that they're enjoying? And the same kind of breakdown. Is it visually appealing? Is it the smell that they're preferring? Is it the taste? Is it the texture? Is it the sound? What is it that the child is preferring? And so what we've noticed is, for children who are hyposensitive in different sensations, these children often prefer crunchy foods over other textures because they're getting so much more feedback. Remember, hyposensitivity, they're going to seek it out. So these are children who are going to want pretzels and crackers, and not just chicken nuggets, but burnt chicken nuggets, burnt toast, because what happens when it's burnt? It's crunchier. It gives you more feedback. You have to chew it more. Your mouth has to move more. You get auditory feedback. And so children who are hyposensitive have a preference for those types of foods, and typically have aversions to opposite foods. So foods that are squishy or slimy, maybe different taste or smells. I'll never forget the first time I experienced a child who had a visual aversion to a food, was actually when I was a student at MJC, and I was working in the special needs lab and a special needs inclusion lab. And working with a child who has he had autism and sensory processing disorder, but he would be across the room and see oranges out on the table and have a physical reaction to just seeing these oranges. He would throw up every time he would see the oranges. And so as a student, I said, oh my goodness, we need to take these oranges out of the room. We should not put oranges out. This child has this horrible reaction. And I will never forget Debbie Lafranchini supporting me and understanding, no, taking this away will mean this child has this aversion for the rest of its life. What we need to do is gradually support him and exposing him to oranges. And so we put oranges all over our environment. We put them in the play table. We put them in all these different areas and always had them out and available for snack. And eventually this child was able to sit at the table with oranges out. And so that was progress. And that took like 2 months just for him to sit at the table with oranges. And then I remember Debbie saying, okay, now we're going to get him to touch them. And sure enough, he would gag and gag and gag and sometimes throw up. And I was so nervous to have this child have a physical reaction, but I saw the progress. So eventually, after about 5 months, this child was able to put an orange to his mouth and put it down. Did he eat it? Not necessarily, but he would put it to his lips and then put it down. That was huge progress compared to throwing up just across the room looking at an orange. So it is a gradual integration process, but it is possible to support children in tolerating things that they previously had aversions to. Another child that I'm thinking of, he was one of those children who preferred all the burnt things. So his poor mom was saying, I just want him to eat something, anything. He's not getting any nutrients. And so I worked with the speech pathologist before we had an OT come in, and the speech pathologist came in and she said, okay, let's try putting something in between 2 burnt pieces of toast and see how he does. So we did grilled cheese. We burnt the 2 sides of the bread and put a little tiny slice of melted cheese. And we thought, oh, we were so slick and so smart. And this child got it, took a bite and went, bleh. He could taste it, took it out, opened it up, took the cheese out, continued to eat his burnt toast. We could have easily said, well, that didn't work. We're not going to try it again. But we did. We tried it again and again and again and again for months until one day he took a bite and chewed it and swallowed it. And it was a huge victory for all of us. And it just goes to show you that just trying something once is never enough to see if it's going to work for the child and the family. So now let's talk about hypersensitivity. Children who are hypersensitive in their sensory input, whether it's tactile or visual or taste or touch, they tend to have a very difficult time tolerating crunchy foods. I had one child that I worked with, and she was just over 2 years old, and we asked her family, one of the questions on the assessment was, does she tolerate different textures, and is she able to chew and swallow? And they said, oh yeah, she chews everything. And so the speech pathologist was there, and we both sat there and we're like, okay, well, let's give her something to eat so we can watch her. And so they gave her a big piece of like a biscuit, like a little biscuit cracker. And we're watching her, and she wasn't chewing. What she was doing is actually sucking on that biscuit until it got really soggy, and she was able to just move it to the back of her mouth. She wasn't chewing at all. And so it was really helpful for us to let her parents know that actually she isn't able to chew all these different textures. She has found a way to get it soggy enough to move to the back of her throat to swallow. And so she ended up getting some feeding therapy and really helped her in how to move her mouth in order to chew and swallow. Um, but she preferred squishy food. She loved pasta. She loved applesauce. She loved yogurts and puddings because it was easy for her to move that food to the back of her throat. So there's just some examples of children who have experienced either hyper or hyposensitivity in their sensory processing, and it has affected their ability to tolerate food. There's so much more information out there. I would always consult either a speech pathologist or an occupational therapist in order to support you as a professional working with children who have sensory aversion. And I want to make sure that everyone knows that we all have sensory issues. We all have sensory, different ways we process sensory information. But having an aversion doesn't necessarily mean that you have disorder. Sensory processing disorder means that the way that you're processing input is so severe that it impacts your daily life. You're not able to fully function because the input is either too much or it's too little, and it's affecting your ability to function. So in your discussion this week, you're going to look at how sensory processing looks like in your own life. And even though you might have some areas where you're like, oh yeah, I really do not like this type of touch, it doesn't mean you have sensory processing disorder. It just means that you have different preferences. So very, very interesting to look at. Something I really enjoy talking about and supporting children in, because so often sensory processing disorder looks like bad behavior. And it's really easy for teachers and professionals to look at a child throwing something or bumping into something or hitting someone and say, oh, that child's just naughty. But until we look at the whole picture and eliminate some sensory processing issues, we can't leave this out. We can't say, oh, well, maybe he just needs some, or she needs some support in this, in processing input. And that's what's triggering some of these responses. So I encourage you to always use sensory processing as maybe one of the reasons that a child might be acting a certain way, instead of always going to, oh, well, that child's just naughty. So I hope you enjoyed this topic as much as I do. Please reach out if you have any questions, but I hope you have a wonderful rest of your week. Bye.